Good to have you all here, different location than the past three services, and it's been a while since you all have been in here in this particular building. Of course, different circumstances these days than before, but it's nice to see all of you, and some we're visiting today. And again, I know many of you here have driven a good distance to be here, and some of you have driven a good distance several nights in a row, and then again on a Saturday morning. And so we appreciate that and respect your dedication to that. There's so much going on. It's encouraging. And for those of you who are on Zoom, where's our camera? There's our camera. Yes, it's good to have you with us from wherever you are this morning. We've talked quite a bit about Old Testament archaeology, if you want to use that term. And most archaeology does relate to the Old Testament for the simple reason the Old Testament covers many centuries of human history. The New Testament, the whole thing is in less than a century, and really less than a half century. If you take when Jesus starts his ministry, and then when the book of Acts finishes, and even to the epistles. If you want to go into Revelation, I guess, then you're getting closer to a century. The churches of Asia, and there's a good bit of archaeology there. And we'll talk about some of that tomorrow. But for this morning, we're going to leave the Old Testament period and go into the New Testament for a bit, specifically Jesus. And of course, the title slide, as you can see, Did Jesus Exist? And it's archaeology about him and his time period, his ministry. And can archaeology answer that question? If we're going to add, this photo of the Sea of Galilee. It's not archaeology, that's geography. And one thing a lot of us may do sometimes is think about archaeology, but then start talking about geography. Archaeology is looking for physical remains from human beings, cities, farms, weapons, settlements, towns, etc. Geography is places, and the two do overlap sometimes, or they're related to each other, and they help each other out sometimes. But and if you know archaeology, you're going to involve some geography along the way too. So this is a nice photo of the Sea of Galilee. It's really a lake. It's not really a sea, and it's a big name for a very small place. You can see all the way across it at any side at any point, unless it's a very foggy day. But a lot of history around that small lake. We're talking about Jesus and archaeology. We're looking at a very specific period of time, in the early mid-first century AD. That's Jesus' time. And we're looking, at least starting off anyway, in Galilee. It's where he grew up, right? He grew up in Nazareth. So where do we look for Jesus? And if we're looking, if we decide where, okay, Galilee, maybe Nazareth, maybe some places like that, places to read about from his life and his ministry. What do we expect to find? Of course, archaeology is about finding things. And that's one limitation we immediately have. What did Jesus build? And as far as we're not going to expect to find anything that we know Jesus built. Now the Bible says he was a carpenter, right? Actually, that's not the best translation of the word. The word is tekton in Greek, and it actually just means a builder, a contractor, maybe we might say today. In the English translation, so England, the King James, and all that, a lot of things over there are made of wood, and they translate it carpenter, and carpentry is certainly involved. If you go over to Israel and Galilee, that area, most things are made of stone and always have been. And so Jesus, most likely, maybe he worked with wood, but he worked with stone quite a bit because builders work with stone over there. And that works to our advantage in archaeology. Stone's much more durable than wood. And there's a nearby city called Sephra. It's not mentioned in the New Testament, but it was about an hour and a half, 2 hours walk from Nazareth. Big city, lots of Gentile population there. And the entire thing was rebuilt when Jesus was a teenager. And so there's a good chance Jesus and Joseph would have been involved, contracted to help build that, that city. Specialists, builders nearby, so they bring a lot of people in. So Jesus may have helped build Sepphoris, but we don't know that for sure. And if he was involved, what was he involved with? We don't know that. So in archaeology, if we're looking for Jesus, we're not going to find physical things that he left behind for us. And once he started his ministry, he quit building physical things. His legacy is spiritual. His legacy is in people like us, isn't it? So archaeology doesn't really measure that in the same way, though Christians did leave things behind later, so maybe we can measure that. But let's understand, archaeology doesn't answer everything or can't reveal as much about Jesus as it might say, an Old Testament king, for example, who did build things. And the Bible talks about Hezekiah or Solomon or other people building things. And we can find those things in some cases. Not so with Jesus. Can archaeology confirm or affirm the existence of Jesus? And not in the same way, that maybe some other people we've talked about, but some people have tried. For example, about 15, 18 years ago, something like that, 15 years ago, it was 2006, an archaeologist named James Tabor. He teaches, he's an American, teaches at the University of Carolina, I think Chapel Hill. Anyway, I've met him a couple of times, and he did a TV series with another guy who did archaeology on TV. The TV guy's not really an archaeologist, but he plays one on TV, right? So they teamed up and had a real archaeologist working with a guy who does it for TV, and they announced they discovered the family tomb of Jesus in an area south of Jerusalem, a neighborhood called Tabor. And I don't know if any of you may remember this, 15 years ago, the family tomb of Jesus. And there's a special on TV. And what it is, it's a tomb from the New Testament period, the Roman period. And this is a picture of it. It was actually discovered and excavated back in the 1970s when they were putting in some apartment buildings. And in Israel, the law is you have to have an archaeologist present when you're excavating doing your first work. If you find any ruins, you have to stop and let the archaeologist say whether you can go ahead and continue or whether they should conduct a quick emergency excavation and document it all before allowing the work to continue. And that's what happened here. They found a tomb. So they paused work for a few days. Archaeologists came in and quickly excavated, recorded, discovered and wrote down, took pictures of everything. And then they covered up the tomb with a little concrete box over it to preserve it, and then finished the apartment complex. And so the tomb is still there. You just can't see it anymore. It's covered up. There's an access hole, but most people don't use that, like a manhole or something, if anyone wants to get in there in the future. But it's a tomb from the time of Jesus, basically. And inside, they found a very typical thing for that period. They called them bone boxes. Ossuary is a fancy name. Basically, in the time of Jesus, when Jews had a funeral, when someone would pass away, they put the body in one of these tombs, like we think about with Jesus, and the body would stay there for a year, typically. Then after a year, traditionally, they go in and take the bones. The body would have deteriorated by then. And they take the bones and put them in a smaller box made of stone, a bone box, an ossuary. And the bones would stay in there, and they could reuse that surface space for someone else who passed away later. And so you get to a tomb that's been in use for a while, and you'll see several of these bone boxes, these ossuaries. And some of them have one person's bones inside. Some of them have 2 or 3 people's bones inside. Relatives or family members, they might put their bones together in one box. We found a lot of them. They found 6 of them in here with names written on the side, and the names are interesting. And you can see why they might raise some eyebrows when you're excavating a tomb near Jerusalem. One of these boxes was inscribed, Jesus, son of Joseph. Whoa, that sounds familiar. There's another one with the name of Mary, another one with the name of Matthias, which is like a nickname for Matthew. Okay, well, one of his disciples was named Matthew, right? There's one called Yossi, which is the short version of the name Joseph. And then there's one called Judah, son of Jesus. And then another one, Mariamna Umara. And maybe it's 2 different names like Miriam and Mara. Some try to translate it Miriam, the master. What the archaeologist translates it that way. There's some question. But it's like a Miriam, a version of Mary. And so what this archaeologist, Dr. Tabor, concluded is that look at all these names together, the time period of Jesus near Jerusalem, and he found a Canadian mathematician and kind of got him to put some statistics together that say the odds are with these names in this place, it would have to be Jesus' family tomb. The mathematician later said, nope, if this represented me, that's not what it actually means. But on the TV show, that's the way they put it. And so, but what do we think of that? Well, there's some problems with it. Remember what we talked about, minding the gap. What do we actually have? And then how do we interpret, or what do we conclude? Very different things. There's always a gap in what we have, what we find, and what we think it means. There's always a gap. And sometimes it's a small gap, and it's pretty clear what it means. It's very logical. Sometimes there's a big gap, and we have to jump a long ways to get to the conclusion we want. Well, this one, some questions that we need to ask. First of all these names, yes, most of these are associated with Jesus in the scripture. Jesus, Joseph, Mary, Matthew. They're not known to be a family member, but they were all very common names in that period. For example, from what we found in inscriptions, it seems Mary was an extremely common name among women. They estimate from what we found, maybe up to 1 out of every 4 women in the time of Jesus in that area was named Mary, or a version of Mary. That's pretty remarkable. But how many Marys are there in the Gospels? I think 6 different Marys are mentioned in the Gospels. And so that kind of bears it out. Isn't that pretty consistent? There's Jesus' mother, there's Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, there's Mary the Magdalene, and there are a few other Marys mentioned just as references in there. Like 6 different Marys in the Gospels. So a very, very common name. Joseph, Jesus, Judah, and Matthew are all top 10 male names in Judah and Galilee in the time of Jesus, all of them. And if we keep going on, we've actually found 2 other ossuaries in different tombs inscribed Jesus, son of Joseph. So this isn't even the first time we found someone named Jesus whose father was Joseph. Common names. Statistically, you're going to find a few if you dig up enough ossuaries, do enough tombs. And we found 99 ossuaries with the name Jesus, son of anyone in Judea and Galilee. So it's very common. And we found Jesus, son of Joseph, but no one's raised eyebrows and bows because they understand it's a common name. The original archaeologist who excavated this tomb back in the 70s, Amos Kloner is his name. And after this came out, here's what he said about it. All this Jesus family tomb, it makes a great story for TV or film, but there's no likelihood that Jesus and his relatives had a family tomb. They were a Galilee family, first of all, not a Jerusalem family, wrong part of the country. Their family has no ties to Jerusalem. Everything we know about Jesus in any record doesn't connect him to Jerusalem in any way. He visited there, he taught there. That's not where he's from. It's not where his family is from. They're a Galilee family. You're in the wrong part of the country. If you're looking for a family tomb of Jesus, you're digging in the wrong place. And there's an Indiana Jones quote. That's it for this lesson. Okay. No, but if you're going to make a big claim, like this is the family tomb of Jesus, you need to be able to have some good evidence to support it. That's a big thing to claim, to say. But there's a gap. What do we have? And we're trying to claim this. There's a big gap there. And the burden of proof to make a statement like that just simply isn't met. And it contradicts what we know about Jesus in Scripture. So TV, video, it sounds great. They can make it sound very compelling and maybe even probable, but it's not. And I'll go ahead and mention now. We'll talk more about this in the next lesson. Beware of video archaeology, whether it's TV, whether it's a documentary. And the simple reason is archaeologists don't make documentary TV. Media people make documentary TV. Who's making the final decisions on those? Media people. And their goals and their aims, their priorities are different than archaeologists. We'll talk more about that next lesson. Doesn't mean they're all bad, but I've never seen one that's entirely correct. Not even, for well-meaning ones that we try to do some research. But anyway, let's well, how about Bethlehem? Jesus was born in Bethlehem, right? Now that's not where he's from. It's down south, a few miles from Jerusalem. That's where he was born, but we know that. And so if we go to Bethlehem today, here's a picture of the town basically as it is now. The ancient town is on top of the hill, and modern day Bethlehem is spread out quite a bit into the valleys and fields, probably the very fields where the shepherds saw the angels who when Jesus was born. There are buildings there now in all those fields around it. And so we don't know exactly which field it was anyway, but it doesn't matter. But archaeology, is there anything to this birth? Well, up top on the hill, for about 1,500 years now, there's been a church building there, originally built by the Emperor Justinian, the Byzantine emperor. It's called the Church of the Nativity. And it's a church building built on top of the traditional location of Jesus' birth. The tradition is Jesus was born in a cave. And 500 years after he was born, there's this tradition, and the emperor built this big church building that still stands today. The building itself is an historical artifact, one of the oldest buildings in the country. That's still intact. But the claim is that it's built over where Jesus was born. We don't know that. The tradition arose, but it came about sometime later after he was born, and the entire local population was deported. About a century, two major wars against the Romans, especially in the 120s AD. There was a huge war against Rome, about 50 years after the one that destroyed Jerusalem. And all the Jews in the region were banished. And so your local memory goes with that. And so some disruption. We don't know really whether Jesus was born here. Maybe, but we don't have anything to prove. But you go inside, and there's a cave, supposedly where it happened. It's all been decorated and so on now for people to worship. And in the spot where traditionally he was born, they have this little star embedded in the floor. You can go and touch it, and you're touching, the spot, the space where Jesus came into the world. And you turn around and go behind, and there's a spot where they say his manger was, a stone manger. And, that's a lot of very specific claims. The best we can say is maybe, nothing more than that. Maybe, but there's a gap between the traditions and what we actually have, what we conclude. So in terms of archaeology, does any of this really confirm anything for us about Jesus? Can we look at these places? Yes, Jesus definitely existed, because that might have been, a stone manger right there. No. Maybe it was a stone manger for animals kept in the cave, perhaps, but we don't know anything beyond that. That doesn't tell us anything more than that. So archaeology, in this case, doesn't really help us with Bethlehem. These shrines don't inform us about Jesus' existence. He existed, he didn't exist, those things can still be there. So what do we do? Can archaeology answer anything? Well, they can. But go to Nazareth. I mentioned Nazareth earlier. He was raised up there. And here's modern Nazareth. It's a pretty decent sized city. 20,000 people, I believe, live there. Maybe more than that, a little more than that now. It was a small village, maybe just a few hundred people at most in Jesus' time. And one problem is that the modern city is built on top of the ancient village. If you want to excavate the ancient village, you have to tear down modern buildings. And people who own those buildings or live in those buildings don't usually like that. Hey, can I kick you out of your home and tear down your house because I want to dig and see if there's some ancient building below? Well, thank you, but no, I'm quite happy to have my house, my business. And so even if you dig and find something, and they happen a little bit, it's valuable real estate. And if you dig, how do you know whether Jesus is connected with whatever you find? Unless you find some specific inscription, Jesus, son of Joseph, was here. And this is the Messiah, by the way. We're not going to find an inscription like that, probably. So I'm just going to sit there and leave it open. It's not good for archaeology. We don't have a lot of options there. We have found a few things, but what would we expect to find? If we're looking for Jesus in archaeology, what would we hope to find? And what are the chances of actually finding that? Probably not great. So if we're looking to confirm Jesus archaeologically, they found a house, or a couple of houses here and there. and someone immediately claims we found a house, and it may be the house of Jesus, Mary and Joseph's house. How do we know that? How many families lived in that town? And how do we know which house was theirs? There's no way to know that unless you find something remarkable which demonstrates it. So can we confirm it? I'm going to say yes, we can in some ways, because not necessarily the physical objects, but documents, scrolls, historical records count with archaeology, because these things are usually excavated. It's a lot of the times we find a library, we find tablets. So documents and historical records come from archaeology a lot of the time. There's an overlap. Now you're getting into history, which is a little different in some ways, but there's an overlap. And we do have some references to Jesus from historical records. Let's start with a Roman historian named Tacitus. And some of us have heard of Tacitus. He lived in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, almost a century after Jesus. He was a Roman, and he describes a lot of Roman history, but he mentions something about, when he's talking about the Emperor Nero. He wrote about several of the Caesars. And look at his quotes. This is after the Great Fire of Rome, and people suspected Nero might have set it so he could rebuild this whole section in his own image. And so here's the quote from his annals. Neither human effort nor the emperor's generosity ended the scandalous belief that the fire had been ordered by Nero. Therefore, to put down that rumor, Nero substituted his culprits and punished in most unusual ways those hated for their shameful acts, whom the crowd called Christians. And that's not a typo, that's the Latin, Christians. Instead of Christians with an I, it's Christians with an E. But then it goes on. The founder of this name, Christus, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. And suppressed for a time, the deadly superstition erupted again not only in Judea, the origin of this evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things horrible and shameful from everywhere come together and become popular. So a little bit of humor in that, isn't there? Kind of a dawn on, what's Rome really like? Well, every bad thing eventually comes into Rome, including this whole thing from Judea, these Christians and their founder, Christus, who was executed by Pontius Pilate back in the time of Tiberius, which is when Jesus was put to death. And so all that is factually correct. Christus is the Latin form of the Greek Christos, which is where Christ comes from. And Christians, maybe you heard the word and was mispronounced and wrote it out with one vowel difference. It's obvious that no one questions. He's talking about Christians. And Nero tried to blame Christians for the Great Fire of Rome. Christians were considered kind of weird anyway. They rejected the Roman gods, which is bad in Roman eyes. If you didn't accept the Roman gods, you were considered an atheist. And you believe in one invisible God, doesn't count. You're still considered an atheist. And that's bad and suspicious. These Christians, these Christians were part of that. So there's no doubt Tacitus talks very matter-of-factly about Jesus and what we know about his execution. And he says Christianity originated with Christ, Christus, and executed by Pilate. It started in Judea, came to Rome. The New Testament tells us all this, doesn't it? Tacitus doesn't say, well, we don't know if that guy really existed. He accepts his existence. And so did other enemies. None of the original enemies of Christians questioned whether Jesus ever existed. All of them accepted it. The question is, the practices of these people who follow Jesus. And Tacitus isn't just some average Joe. He was a Roman proconsul, like a governor at one point, and he had access to all the records that Rome ever accumulated. And Rome kept records, birth certificates, death certificates, law and order, records of executions. They kept records of all that. Tacitus had access to anything he needed. And no one, again, whoever was an enemy of Christians in early centuries, ever doubted that Jesus existed. People who questioned whether he existed, that's our time, centuries later. And so that's sort of a new thing. And so Tacitus confirms what the Bible says. Jesus existed, and he was executed in this time and this place by these people. It would have been very easy to disprove Jesus' existence back then, and no one ever tried to do it. Josephus is another one. He's a famous Jewish historian. Wasn't a Christian. He took part in the first great Jewish war against Rome. He was actually a commander on the Jewish side for a while. Then when he lost, he was able to work out a surrender and change sides and join the Romans, and became adopted by the Roman general Vespasian. And Vespasian later became the emperor of Rome. And Josephus worked under his good graces and wrote the history of the war and was kind to the Romans. But notice what he talks about. He's talking about Josephus's in his Antiquities, the high priest Annas, who's mentioned in the New Testament. There's a passage here. He says, Annas being this kind of person, in the context, he's a rigid, harsh Sadducee. Josephus doesn't like the Sadducees. And Annas was one of those rigid, harsh Sadducees. So Annas, thinking he had a favorable opportunity because the former governor Festus had died and the new guy was still on the way, called a meeting of judges and brought in the brother of Jesus, who was called Messiah, James by name, and some others. And he made an accusation. They transgressed the law. They handed them over to be stoned. Jesus' brother James was stoned to death on the orders of Annas. Notice here, Josephus, not a Christian, but how does he connect people? The high priest wanted to take care of some enemies before the new governor showed up and got him into trouble. So he found the brother of this Jesus, who some were calling Messiah, and had him killed. Not a Christian, but a Jew, enemy, doesn't think well of Christians, but he confirms Jesus existed and his brother existed. If we go on in another section of his Antiquities, this one's been doctored a bit, it seems. Here's the whole passage as it currently stands. Around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. He was one who did surprising deeds, and a teacher of such people as accepted truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And talks about Pilate, and then talking about him, the prophets, and restored to life. But people don't believe Josephus really would have written all this. Josephus wasn't a Christian. He was a Jew. He never joined the Christians. He never became one. And going through other copies and trying to use some reasonable conclusions, the original passage, according to one scholar, probably read something like this. Around this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, did surprising deeds, a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly, won over many Jews and Greeks. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who in the first place came to love him did not give up their affection for him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, have still to this day not died out. That's probably closer to the original text. Maybe some later Christians added some things to make it more reverential to Christ. Anyway, Josephus talks about Jesus in two different places, doesn't question his existence. And so from that aspect, we have two different people, one a Roman, one a Jew, neither one a Christian, affirming Jesus did exist and he was executed and his followers continued. So their support. Tacitus and Josephus, non-believers who affirm the existence of Jesus. And so we've made these points here. Let's keep going. Okay. Now the question of is he the Son of God? That's not something archaeology can answer. Jesus existed, yes. Was he the Son of God? Archaeology can't help us. It's beyond the scope. That's where our faith comes in, isn't it? We still live by faith, even if we find things to look at and touch and so on. But we have every reason to believe Jesus did indeed exist. How about his ministry? We do have some finds, discoveries that relate to places he visited. And archaeology gives us a very good idea. Let's start the city of Magdala. Magdala, the town, is not directly mentioned in the Bible. So can we think of anyone from Magdala? Mary the Magdalene. She was from Magdala. It's a tiny town. It was a town right on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. Two interstate highways met there. So it's like everyone, if you're traveling, you spend the night at Magdala probably. Freshwater lake, clean water, watering animals, eat something, spend the night, and continue your journey the next day. It's a popular spot for people traveling. And it was right on the international highway, the way of the sea. People traveling from Egypt all the way up to Babylon, Mesopotamia, Turkey, The highway ran right by here, and Magdala was one of the stops. So there's some international traffic there as well. If you're going anywhere around Galilee, you're going to pass through Magdala at some point. It's at the crossroads of the highways. And some of you may have seen or heard about this. A few years ago, excavating to put in a hotel, they found some ruins, and they found a synagogue. And the dating from the pottery, and especially from a stash of coins they found. Coins are great for dating things. They have the picture or the name of the current leader when they were minted. Got a bunch of coins from the first half of the first century. That's Jesus' ministry. This synagogue was in use during Jesus' lifetime, during his ministry. And it's very well preserved. The floor, that's the original floor. You can see it had little mosaic tiles and decorative patterns. That's original, not restored. They scraped the dirt off, and there it is. And so it's right there. And there's a big roof over it to protect it. It's a popular stop for tour groups right now. But Magdala, the synagogue, did Jesus preach there? Well, we don't know 100%. We do know in Matthew 4, verse 23, Jesus went throughout all Galilee teaching in the synagogues. This is, he passed by the synagogue all the time. This is the main road. You don't get from here to there without walking past this synagogue. Was this one of the ones Jesus taught in? And that's where our interpretation comes in. Probably. Most likely. We never can say 100%, but this is pretty likely he taught it here. And if in the middle there was a central space, typical synagogues, the crowd would sit around, all around you, and you'd stand in the middle or sit in the middle, read scripture, make a discussion. That's how it worked. It wasn't like our tradition. Everyone sits and faces the front. Everyone faced the center of the synagogue. That's the way they worked. So most likely Jesus stood in the middle of that picture between those columns and preached to the people sitting all around. And some of the benches are still in place. You can make it out the far wall. Some of the benches, you can still see they're curved a little bit because the ground is shifted. But those are the benches where the men would sit. Women would typically sit on a second level above. But so most likely Jesus preached here and maybe walked on this very time. Quite a thing, isn't it? There's another synagogue over on the other side of the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee, a place called Gamla. And again, Gamla is not mentioned, but it's the best preserved synagogue from the time of Jesus that we have. And I've been there once. It's a little bit of a hike to get down there. So bring your hiking boots if you want to see it up close. It's not terrible, but it's a bit of a walk. And you have to go back up. You don't just drive up next to it. But a very well-preserved synagogue. This is technically a little bit outside of Galilee, but it's in the region, and there's a chance Jesus came through here as well, and maybe stood in the middle of that one. There are other synagogues in the region, but these are two of the best ones. Here's another one, Capernaum. We know Jesus was at Capernaum, on the coast, just a few miles around from Magdala. And the city itself doesn't exist anymore. We just have ruins. But we go there, and we know quite a bit. The name Capernaum, by the way, means the village of Nahum, Kafar Nahum. And the translation to English, Capernaum, is how we say it now, right? In English. Is it the Nahum? We don't know. But someone named Nahum in the past, maybe the prophet, maybe not. The village is named for him. Maybe the guy who founded it, who knows. But after the death of John the Baptist, Jesus went to Matthew 4 and lived in Capernaum. So he made it his hometown for a while. He didn't just always travel around. He used it as a base. He had a house, whether he stayed with Peter or had his own rented place or whatever. Now, he lived there for a period of time and would go out and come back from Capernaum. And Jesus encountered 5 of his apostles there: Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Matthew. Matthew worked there. He was a tax collector. In fact, it makes sense. It was a border town. As you can make out, there's a color difference in the photo. You see where Capernaum is on the lake. Go a little to the right, and you see a line coming down to the Sea of Galilee. That's the Jordan River. It was a boundary. The other side of that line is yellowish on the map. That was a different political district. And the city of Bethsaida was on that side. That's where Peter and Andrew were originally from. But they moved to Capernaum, possibly because crossing the border, you probably had to pay a tax or a toll to come in. Matthew probably managed the taxes for that border crossing. amongst other taxes. So Matthew had his tax office set up in the first town when you come into this territory. And so Matthew works there for the government. Different taxes, including probably the toll or the border tax. And maybe Peter and Andrew decided the fishing was better in Capernaum, save the money, just move there and quit crossing all the time. But Jesus was there a lot. He performed all these miracles in Capernaum. Pretty impressive. But today there's the coastline. That's where the fishermen somewhere along here would bring in their nets and clean them. And Jesus called James and John somewhere in this photograph probably, where they were fixing their nets afterwards. There's an ancient synagogue we've uncovered and partially reconstructed. Now this particular synagogue dates after Jesus' time. The 3rd, 5th century, 4th, 5th centuries, there's not exactly sure of the date. But so Jesus wasn't actually touching those stones. Here's the inside, pretty fancy schmancy, isn't it? But here's the thing, this synagogue was built on top of the earlier one, from Jesus' time. See the white limestone, the later one with that brown, that dark colored foundation? That dates to the 1st century. It was the 1st century synagogue, and they've dated it by the coins. They went down and did some excavations there. They built this later one on top of the old one. And if you look at the line, they don't quite line up. If you look at the top one, it doesn't follow exactly the line of the foundation. Change direction. You see there's a gap. As you go in the distance, it gets narrower. When you come towards the camera, it's off a little bit. But those black stones were the foundation for the synagogue from Jesus' time. So it's the same space. And so you have 2 synagogues on top of the other. And the bottom one was made from cheap local stone, not very good quality. And it indicates they couldn't afford much better than that. Cheap stuff. But in Luke chapter 7, when there's a centurion who's serving the sick, the Jews asked Jesus to heal him. And one thing they said, hey, he loves our people. He helped us build our synagogue. Apparently, the local Jews didn't have the resources to fund building their own synagogue. So the centurion donated some money to help them. And they appreciated that. It's an indication of the poverty of Capernaum at Jesus' time. And we see it borne out in the archaeology. The synagogue's cheap, but that's all they could afford. And even then, with help. The later one's much more expensive. Better stone brought in from the distance, but a few centuries later, the town's wealthier. So you can see the archaeology demonstrate the economic levels of the city. In Jesus' time, it was poor. The Bible has a reference to it. If you look carefully, and the archaeology bears it out. Some of the things Jesus did were done inside the synagogue. The centurion, the servant, was healed. A paralytic was healed in there. And a man with a withered hand had his hand restored inside the synagogue. So even though these stones are later, it's the same space. Jesus taught and performed miracles in this exact space. And we can walk around in there today and stand in the space just one floor above the original floor where Jesus was, where he stood and talked to the people around him, preached that he was the bread of life in John 6, and performed some miracles. So we have a specific place revealed through archaeology. Let's finish up in Jerusalem really quickly. We're running out of time. This is a model of Jerusalem in Jesus' time. That's a drawing. You see that off to the right? That's the Temple Mount. Herod the Great expanded it and made it this massive 35-acre platform, room for 100,000 worshipers. And it's still there today. That's how it looked in Jesus' time. And the temple's in the middle, but a huge area around it was where they spent most of their time teaching. Those columns under there, shade and acoustics, they were probably under those columns on the edges most of the time when they were teaching, away from the sun and where you could hear better with the echo. Today, it's all covered by Muslim buildings. The platform, the foundations are all still there. That's the view from above the Mount of Olives. Back to the model, that's how it looked. Those doors at the bottom, that was the main entrance to the temple. You can go in on the right, circle counterclockwise, come out on the left. Though if you were in mourning, like someone dying, you go in the left doors and circle the opposite way. And if you go in the opposite way, they knew you were in mourning and someone could offer you an encouraging word. Interesting tradition, isn't it? The floor tiles from excavations, we've learned the temple floor areas had these beautiful patterns in many places. So when you're walking in the temple, you look down in many areas, you have these beautiful geometric styles with stones. We found a lot of those stone fragments. And here's a close-up of the model. We have very detailed descriptions of the temple. We can't really dig there in the Temple Mount, but we are able to access some of the dirt that other people dug out and dumped somewhere else. But see those columns? Beautiful areas, copied from the Greeks, this architecture. And the Greeks would have classes in school under these columns. And Herod built the same thing. So you can imagine rabbis or Pharisees or Jesus standing under one section, talking to whoever's around and in the temple area. And so we have a place. One miracle he performed is the pool of Siloam. He healed a blind man there, put mud in his eyes. He washed him away. You can see, we found the pool of Siloam. There's the model of where it was. It was on this big road going straight to the temple. There's a street. You can go by the pool of Siloam and go on up. And then we covered it. And there it is. We found the original steps. This thing used to be full of water. But Jesus healed the blind man somewhere around here. And we even found some of the road that you walk on to go from the pool up to the temple. Let me finish up here. We're about out of time. This one just has lots of information. So much there. But anyway, this is one of the places where Jesus was. He was here, and we found it. And we can walk around there and make that connection. Let me skip ahead a little bit to the final thing. Let's see here. Trying to read. What's this? You know what? I'm going to pause here for a minute. We'll finish up a couple of things in the next session and go into our topic, fake archaeology. That was a little bit shorter. But let's go ahead. We're going to take a break. We're going to have a song in a minute and have a break, and we'll come back for our next session. I'll finish this up. Let me go ahead and mention Jesus had a powerful effect. Even the Gentiles who wrote about it, even Josephus mentioned Jews and Gentiles were attracted to him. Even though he was sent to the Jews, the Gospels reveal he didn't preach to Gentiles, and Gentiles, like the Roman centurion, showed more faith than most Jews did. Jesus had an ability to touch people back then, and he still touches people today. And maybe some of these things are reminders. I've been asked to offer an invitation, so let's use this. Maybe Jesus touches you, and maybe seeing these things reaffirms faith and the things that he taught us. If so, if you need to respond in any way, do that right now while we stand and sing the song titled Nativity.